Max could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that had nothing to do with the usual hum of the neighborhood. It was something deeper, an instinct that stirred in his chest like a storm on the horizon. He sat by the large window, his dark eyes fixed on the sky. The clouds were heavy, roiling in shades of grey and green, pressing down on the land like a weight too great to bear. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree in the backyard, and the air smelled sharp, metallic. Max's ears twitched at every gust, and he instinctively moved closer to the door, standing on all fours, his body rigid. Inside, the family was busy. His best friend, 8-year-old Tommy, was in the living room with his mother, Maria. Tommy's little sister, Ellie, was holding her stuffed bunny in her arms, her small face creased with worry as she watched the weather channel on the TV. Max's owner, Jason, was on the phone, his voice low and tense, talking to someone about the coming storm. The television buzzed with images of the hurricane now heading toward their coastal town, its winds threatening to break the record books. "Mom," Tommy said, breaking the silence, "is it going to be okay?" Maria knelt beside him, brushing his dark curls from his forehead. "It's going to be okay, sweetie," she said, her voice warm but strained. "We've got Max and we've got each other. We're going to stay safe, all right?" Tommy nodded, though his eyes didn't quite match the reassurance in his mother's tone. He glanced at Max, who had never left his side since they brought him home from the shelter all those years ago. The dog's presence alone seemed to comfort him, as if Max had a way of understanding what Tommy couldn't quite put into words. Max whined, a low, guttural sound that rumbled from deep within his chest. His eyes darted between the door and the family, then back to the sky. Something was wrong. Something was coming. Jason hung up the phone and walked over to the door, his expression grim. He glanced out at the sky, then turned to Maria. "We need to get ready. The storm's going to hit us hard. We have to evacuate now." Maria nodded, already moving toward the hallway to gather the emergency bags. She pulled Tommy and Ellie close, whispering softly to them. Jason crouched down beside, Max running his hand over the dog's thick fur. "You ready, boy?" Jason asked quietly, his voice steady but tinged with worry. Max met his gaze, his eyes dark and intent, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. He wagged his tail once, slowly, almost hesitantly. But it was enough. He was ready. Whatever the storm brought, he would stay by their side. The house began to fill with the frantic energy of last-minute preparations. Tommy and Ellie each grabbed a stuffed animal, while Jason and Maria double-checked the emergency supplies. Max stayed close to them, his head swiveling at every new sound, his muscles coiled and alert. He wanted to stay by their side. He needed to stay by their side. As they loaded into the car, Max climbed into the back seat, his large body wedged between the kids, his fur brushing against their trembling hands. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. The radio played static and urgent warnings, but all Max could focus on was the scent of fear hanging in the air, thick and heavy. They drove through the streets, now nearly deserted, the sky darkening with every passing minute. Max's paws pressed into the cold metal floor of the car as he kept his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the town shrink into the distance. His mind was sharp, the energy around him vibrating with the unknown. The storm was coming. But what Max couldn't know, what no one could know, was that it wasn't just the storm that would change everything. It was the chaos it would bring. The roads would be flooded, the power would go out, and the world, as they knew it, would fracture. Max growled low in his throat, a rumble deep in his chest. He wasn't going to lose them. Not today. Not ever. Max's body jerked awake, his legs stiffened beneath him, and the familiar scent of his family, Jason's aftershave, Maria's lavender perfume, the faint scent of Tommy's peanut butter sandwiches, was gone. In its place was a thick, wet odor of earth and salt, the air heavy with moisture, the sting of seawater rising with every gust of wind. His ears rang with the faintest echoes of thunder, a reminder that the storm was still raging somewhere. Out there, he opened his eyes. The world around him was unrecognizable. The car had been tossed like a toy. It lay on its side, windows shattered, the hood crumpled in on itself. His collar was gone, a casualty of the chaos. Max's fur was matted with blood and dirt, but it didn't hurt. It didn't matter. What mattered was the overwhelming emptiness that swallowed him whole. His family was gone. Max scrambled to his feet, his paws slipping on the slick ground as he darted away from the wreckage. He didn't know how far he had been thrown or how long he had been unconscious, but he could still feel the pounding of his heart, the sharp rush of adrenaline in his veins. He couldn't stop now. He had to find them. He had to get to them. The landscape before him was a wasteland. The streets that had once been familiar were now swallowed by debris, downed trees, shattered glass, overturned cars, and piles of garbage swept from the floodwaters. The hurricane had torn through the town, with no mercy. The sound of water sloshed beneath Max's paws as he made his way through the wreckage, his nose working overtime as he sniffed the air for any sign of his family. He could still hear the echoes of their voices, a distant memory that made his heart ache. Maria's gentle laughter, Jason's deep voice, Tommy's excited chatter, Ellie's soft giggle, the warmth of them, the safety. Gone. Max's teeth were clenched, and his mind raced. He needed to focus. He had to find them, no matter what it took. As he trudged through the remains of their neighborhood, Max noticed other animals too. Some frightened and confused, others injured, all displaced by the storm. A few dogs wandered aimlessly, their collars missing, their eyes wild with fear. A cat with one leg limping, a rabbit cowering in a corner of a collapsed building. Some of the animals were familiar. Ones Max had seen around the neighborhood, perhaps owners who hadn't been as fortunate as his family. But none of them mattered. He needed his family. The sun was a pale, sickly orange in the sky now, casting long shadows across the broken landscape. The wind was still fierce, whipping the remnants of the storm through the streets, but the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Max padded carefully through the wreckage, his muscles aching, his paws sore. But his resolve was unshakable. Hours passed. He stopped occasionally to drink from puddles, his mind ever on the search for his family. There was nothing familiar here, no comforting scent of home, no sign of the family he was desperate to reunite with. Just the endless wreckage, the storm's aftermath. It was then, as the light of the day began to fade, that Max heard something, a distant sound, a voice, low and muffled but unmistakable. His ears pricked and his body stiffened. He stood frozen. For a moment, every muscle in his body taut, straining to hear. The voice sounded again. He could make out the faintest trace of it, muffled by the wind, but it was there. His heart pounded in his chest, and he took off, running toward the sound, his paws slipping on the slick pavement. He pushed himself harder, his body protesting, but the need to find them drove him forward. His pace slowed as he rounded a corner, and he stopped dead in his tracks. There, amidst the twisted wreckage of an old store, he saw her, a small, wet, trembling figure crouched beneath a collapsed shelf, clutching a tattered stuffed animal to her chest. Ellie. Max's heart leapt. He recognized the familiar pink dress she had worn earlier, the little bunny clutched tightly in her arms. She was alive. She was here. Max's tail started to wag, but he didn't bark. His presence was all that was needed. Ellie looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt, and her eyes widened in disbelief as she saw him. Max! Her voice was barely a whisper, a tremulous note of hope threading through the air. Max took a cautious step toward her. His eyes, never leaving hers. She was all alone, just like him, but they weren't alone anymore. Not for long. Ellie reached out a trembling hand, and Max bounded toward her, his body pressed against hers in an instant. His tail wagged furiously, and he nuzzled her face, his nose gently brushing against her cheek as if to say, "I'm here. You're safe now." Ellie cried out in relief, hugging him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "I knew you'd find me," she sobbed into his fur, her breath hitching with the emotion of the moment. Max licked her face, his tail wagging harder than ever. She was alive. He had found her, but that was only part of it. There was still the rest of the family to find. He could feel it in his bones. They weren't far. He had to keep going. Ellie needed to be safe too. Max pulled away from her for a moment, his nose twitching. He sniffed the air, his ears flicking back. The scent of her family was faint, but still there, carried on the wind. We're getting closer. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ruin of the town. The world was a quiet wreck, and yet Max moved as if the world were still alive, the sense of urgency never leaving him. Ellie clung to his side, her small hands grasping his fur as if she feared he might disappear too. Max's paws crunched through the debris-laden streets, his nose to the ground, ever searching for the scent of his family. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of salt water and destruction. Ellie had quieted, her sobs reduced to the occasional sniffle, and Max kept moving forward, his body tense but resolute. He was determined, and Ellie, though frightened, trusted. "Him?" she whispered now and then, her voice tentative, as though speaking aloud might break the fragile reality they found themselves in. "Max, do you think we'll find Mom and Dad?" Max glanced up at her, his dark eyes full of silent understanding. He didn't have the words to comfort her, but his presence spoke louder than any reassurance. He was her protector now, and he would find them. The ruins of the town stretched out before them in all directions. Max wasn't sure how far they'd traveled, but the devastation was the same. Overturned cars, shattered windows, flooded streets where once had been bustling shops and homes. He stopped occasionally to sniff around, testing the air for any sign of his family. His senses were sharp, the world a haze of smells, but the one scent he desperately needed to find remained just out of reach. Ellie's fingers tightened around his fur. "I'm scared, Max." Max paused, his body tense as he looked up at her, his gaze meeting her wide, uncertain eyes. He nuzzled her hand with his nose, trying to offer her comfort. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He would keep going. He had to, for her, for all of them. They moved on through the night, stopping only for short breaks. Max found a dry spot beneath an overturned bench, and Ellie curled up beside him, clutching her bunny tightly. The sound of distant wind and the occasional creak of shifting debris was the only noise in the otherwise still world. Max stood watch, his eyes scanning the empty streets. Morning came as a cold grey light, the world blanketed in a fog that seemed to hold the promise of more devastation. The city was unrecognizable now, like a place that had been abandoned for years. But Max wouldn't let himself give in to the feeling of despair. He pressed on, every step forward a vow. Ellie had fallen asleep against him, her small body tucked into his side for warmth. Max licked her head gently, his instincts telling him to keep her safe. He would keep going until he couldn't anymore, no matter how long it took. After what seemed like hours of trudging through the wreckage, Max's nose caught something. A faint scent, sharp and familiar. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately shifted his path, moving toward the smell. Ellie stirred as he pulled away, her eyes opening, dazed and confused. "Max," she whispered, blinking up at him. Max stopped, his ears perked. He sniffed the air again. This was it, the scent of Jason, faint but unmistakable. Ellie's eyes widened as she looked at him, the hope rising in her chest like a light at the end of a tunnel. "Dad!" Max barked softly and wagged his tail, nudging her gently with his nose. "Come on," he seemed to say. "They're close." They pushed forward, moving as quickly as Max could manage, despite the exhaustion that weighed on both of them. The wreckage grew thicker here, more scattered debris, collapsed buildings, flooded roads that forced them to veer off course. Max's paws were sore, his legs aching, but he kept going. His senses were alive, sharper than ever, pulling him toward that scent. Hours passed and the sun climbed higher, making the heat unbearable. But still, Max pressed on, through the remnants of homes and businesses, until finally they came to a clearing in the middle of what had once been a lively street. A building stood there, half collapsed, but inside there was movement. Max's heart raced. There, among the ruins, was a figure, a person, Jason. Max barked a sharp, excited sound and bounded toward the figure. Jason looked up, his face a mixture of disbelief and pure joy. His voice cracked as he called out, "Ellie! Max, is that really you?" Ellie's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. "Dad!" She ran toward him, stumbling over the debris, but Max was already at his side, his paws lifting to nudge Jason's hand. Jason sank to his knees, his arms wrapping around Ellie as she threw herself into his embrace. Max circled them both, wagging his tail furiously, his heart swelling with joy. They were together again. "Finally, I knew you'd find us," Jason whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as he kissed the top of Ellie's head. He looked down at Max, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Good boy, good boy." Max's tail wagged harder, his chest swelling with pride. They were together again. The family was whole, and the bond between them, forged in the face of disaster, was stronger than ever. But their journey was far from over. The storm may have passed, but the world had changed. There was still so much to do, so many challenges ahead, but for now they were together, and that was enough. Max sat at their feet, his eyes scanning the horizon, his body still tense but now filled with a new sense of purpose. They would survive this. He would make sure of it. The days after the storm were a blur. The world outside was unrecognizable. Shattered buildings, uprooted trees, debris scattered like forgotten memories. But inside the small, makeshift shelter Jason had found, there was a quiet hope. The family was together, and that was all that mattered. Max lay by the fire, his eyes half closed as he listened to the soft, comforting sounds of his family settling into a new routine. Ellie had fallen asleep in Jason's lap, her hand still clutching her bunny as she snored softly. Maria, too, was exhausted but smiling as she stitched up a small tear in Tommy's jacket. Tommy sat nearby, fidgeting with his makeshift toy, a stick he had found outside, but his eyes often drifted to Max, filled with a quiet admiration. Max had done it. He had found them when they had lost hope. He had guided them through the wreckage of their world, and now he rested knowing his job was done. But in his heart, Max knew that this wasn't the end. The world had changed, but that didn't mean the journey was over. They had each other, and that was the foundation they would build on. Jason stood, stretching his stiff muscles before walking toward the door of the shelter. "I'm going out to scout," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that still lingered in the air. Maria looked up, her brow furrowed with concern. "Be careful," she warned, but her voice held a thread of optimism. "I will," Jason promised. He glanced down at Max, who was already on his feet, tail wagging in anticipation. "You're coming with me, buddy?" Max padded toward him, without hesitation, his ears alert, ready for whatever came next. Jason knelt to adjust his pack, and Max stood at his side, their silent communication clear. It was time to move forward. Ellie stirred in her sleep, murmuring Max's name as she clutched her bunny tighter. Max paused, his eyes shifting between her and Jason. He didn't want to leave her, not yet, but Jason was a part of their pack too. Max had always known that his loyalty to the family meant that he had to stay close to them, to protect them all. It was time for the next step of their journey, and he wouldn't let anything stop them. He barked softly, nudging Jason's hand, and Jason smiled. "Let's go," Jason said, and the two of them stepped outside into the overcast sky. The landscape was different now, covered in layers of wreckage and water, but nature was already fighting back. Wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the cracks of the pavement, and birds soared above, as if the world itself was finding a way to heal. There was something peaceful in that, something Max could sense deep in his bones. No matter how much, the world had changed. It was still alive, and they were alive too. Max sniffed the air, his nose twitching as he sought out new scents. The remnants of the storm lingered, but beneath it, there was a promise. The road ahead would be hard, but with his family by his side, they could rebuild. They traveled through the town, weaving between the wreckage, Jason pausing occasionally to assess their surroundings. But Max's senses were keen, his head always swiveling, ever watchful. He wasn't just looking for danger, he was looking for the path forward. It was instinct, the drive to protect, to lead, to survive. After hours of walking, they reached the outskirts of the town, where the land opened up to rolling hills. In the distance, a small cluster of houses could be seen, untouched by the storm's fury. "A safe haven? Looks like we're not the only ones who made it," Jason muttered, squinting toward the horizon. Max's tail wagged, his body moving with renewed energy. This was it, the first sign of new life. The future, still uncertain, now lay within their reach. As they walked toward the distant houses, Max's eyes flicked over his family, Ellie's small hand still clutching the stuffed bunny, Tommy's hopeful face, Maria's quiet smile, and Jason's firm but caring gaze. They had survived the storm. They had found each other in the darkness, and together they would rebuild. The world may have been broken, but Max knew something essential. That home wasn't just a place. It was the people you loved, the bonds you forged, and the trust that held you together even in the hardest times. And no matter where they went, no matter how far they had to travel, Max would be there. He would always be there. As the family reached the edge of the new beginning, Max looked up at the sky, the clouds parting just enough to let a sliver of sunlight break through. It was a sign, a promise. They would survive. They would thrive. And together, they would make it home.